Hello everyone, welcome back to our third lecture in our Unit 3 series, Clash of Cultures. Today we're going to be taking a little bit more of a broader look at what was happening in the late Cold War stages, specifically in the Middle East. But we're going to get away from the Arab-Israeli conflict and take a look at some of the other major events happening in the Middle East. And we're also going to see more emphasis on what the United States was doing within our geopolitical relationships with those nations. So again, as I've stated before, I feel like this unit is perhaps more relevant than a lot of the other units we've studied throughout the year, and I hope by the end of today's lecture, which should be a short one by the way, that you understand a little bit better as to our relationship with a lot of these Middle Eastern nations and perhaps why they are either positive or negative today. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the lecture. This period we're going to cover here deals really from the late 1970s all the way up through around 2000, and we'll talk about we'll end with the War on Terror, but we're going to talk initially about the events that happened in 1979. 1979 was a tremendously fateful year in the Middle East region, and starting with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Now, to understand the revolution itself, we have to go back and we have to look at what led to that revolution, and really you can pinpoint a major event that took place in 1953, and that was when the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, basically helped lead a coup in Iran. Now, there was a democratically elected leader. He had more socialist leanings. So, again, in the Cold War setting, the United States was not very positive with leadership that showed tendencies towards socialism or communism. And so the CIA helped lead a revolution, a coup in that country to replace that democratically elected leader. Now, in its place, they placed a man, the Shah. And the Shah was basically a king that ruled in Iran, and even though he was very pro-Western, had a lot of liberal ideas in terms of influence on society. In fact, if you had seen Iran in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of what the women were wearing, very, very Western styles. I mean, I've seen pictures of, even people in miniskirts that you would not expect in very conservative Iran. Well, over the 1960s and 70s, the people of Iran began to grow tired of the Shah, and there was a massive call to return to a more conservative society. Now, one leader that they pointed to who had actually been exiled, he was living outside of Iran, he'd been kicked out by the Shah, was the leader Ayatollah Khomeini. He's the man pictured in the upper right-hand corner. Now, in 1979, the people of Iran are going to lead a revolution to overthrow the Shah and to install what amounts to a theocracy, a government that is based off of religious principles, and they invite Khomeini back into the country to lead them. And he has a very anti-Western, very anti-U.S. approach, and frankly, this is kind of the beginning of this anti-Western, anti-United States sentiment in Iran. Again, pretty bitter about the overthrow back in 1953, but it's just become worse since 1979. Now, that exact same year when the revolution was occurring, one of the major moments of that revolution was when hundreds of Iranian, primarily students, stormed the gates of the United States Embassy in Tehran, the capital. They overtook the U.S. Embassy, which technically, according to international law, is U.S. territory, and it had a number of U.S. citizens working within that embassy. But hundreds of students stormed the gates, and they took over that embassy, and they held all the Americans inside hostage. Now, this hostage crisis lasted well longer than anybody would have expected. It lasted a total of 444 days that these 52 Americans were held hostage by the Iranians. And frankly, it actually influenced one of our political elections, because in 1980, Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, But the big problem with Carter was he wasn't able to get the hostages out of Iran. Not that he didn't try through negotiation, but also through military maneuvers. We sent in some elite military forces, which sadly, of course, there had to be an accident. There was a crash of the helicopter in the desert, killing all of the special forces that were being sent in to rescue the hostages. And for Jimmy Carter, it turned from bad to worse. And so the result was he actually ended up losing the election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. And the very next day, the Iranian people let go of the hostages. So that's what brought about an end to that. They really influenced our own presidential election. But again, the relationship with Iran today is very, very, it's a negative relationship. And you can see here why with the background. Now, that exact same year, there's going to be some major events happening east of Iran, and that is the invasion of Afghanistan, this time by the Soviet Union. Now, unbeknownst to most people at the time, the Soviet Union was collapsing. Now, of course, the Soviet Union was a very closed government. They did not allow a lot of information in or out, and so we really didn't understand the full ramifications of how declined that economy and that government had become. But I'll tell you, the invasion of Afghanistan is kind of like the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union, because in the 10 years that they fight there, by the time they get out, it has become so costly in this invasion that their economy is teetering on collapse, and the Soviet Union will ultimately collapse. And a big part of it was because of this failed invasion of Afghanistan. Well, let's describe the background here. Because kind of like what we were talking about with Iran, the Soviet Union had played a lot of politics in the regions surrounding their country, and they had helped install a communist leader in Afghanistan who was being overthrown. So that is why they invaded in 1979, and they would be in that country for almost 10 years, and they would fight the people of Afghanistan, people that began to call themselves the Mujahideen. And these were Muslim freedom fighters that were fighting against the Soviet Union. In fact, at times they got the United States help. We supplied them weapons, we supplied them money, we supplied them aid to fight off basically this common enemy we had in the Soviet Union. Now, ultimately, once the Soviet Union is defeated, they withdraw. The Mujahideen did not have any, kind words for us. We were also kind of seen as the enemy. The Soviets were just the immediate enemy. There's a lot of anti-Western sentiment in Afghanistan that had been built up to this point, but will continue. One of those Mujahideen, these Muslim fighters, was a young man named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden will, of course, go on to form a very radical and extremist Islamic terror group called Al-Qaeda, which will ultimately attack the United States multiple times, but the biggest of those attacks would culminate on September 11, 2001. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, after the invasion and after the Soviet Union ultimately would leave in 1988, the Afghani people would devolve into a civil war, and that civil war would last from around 1992 to 1996, although a lot of the major players were fighting well before that and even after that. What we saw in Afghanistan was a lot of these tense rivalries within the Middle East kind of playing its part. So as you can see there, the Saudis were backing one side, the Iranians were backing another. You've had a couple of assignments up to this point where you saw, the religious differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So they are vying for power, and they saw Afghanistan as being kind of one of those chess pieces that they could maneuver to try and get a leg up on their enemy. So Afghanistan, to me, is one of the most tragic of historical stories in the late 20th century, because it has been completely war-torn for really going on 40 years at this point. And of course, we're going to talk about them later on after the attacks on September 11th. One term I would like you to know is the Taliban. The Taliban will take over at the end of this civil war in 1996, and they are an extremely conservative, very, radically conservative They are introducing, kind of like what we saw in Iran, a theocracy where the government is based off of religious ideals, and those ideals come from, frankly, the 7th century A.D. So, what the West sees as very harsh ruling. The Taliban will also be open to harboring groups like Al-Qaeda, like men like bin Laden, and ultimately it's going to be to take out the Taliban that we invade after 9/11. So they are now a part of this story, and we're going to see them pop up here rather soon. Now, in the 1980s, there was a major war that took place in the Middle East, the Iran-Iraq War, from 1980 to 1988. And I don't feel like this war gets talked about very much, but this was a devastating war for both countries involved. Now, this is another example of these two major Islamic denominations based in two different countries being kind of the root of this conflict. In Iran, where you had a majority, the Shia government, very conservative, was fighting the government of Iraq, which had a Sunni government, but actually had a Shia majority people. I know that's a little confusing, but basically you need to know that Iran and Iraq, the Shia and Sunni background, that divide is still present, one of the basic reasons why this conflict happened. But the war itself was devastating to both sides. The way it was fought was brutal. Both sides are going to be using chemical weapons in this war. In fact, that'll have an effect on the next war when we fight Saddam Hussein. But both sides are using things like poisonous gas, which we really haven't seen since World War I. But just a devastatingly brutal war. Now, to make matters worse, I guess, for the people of Iraq and Iran, the United States was, really didn't have a major friend in this conflict, and we were actually supplying weapons to both sides of the Iran-Iraq war. Publicly, we were supporting Iraq with the dictator Saddam Hussein. In fact, in the picture in the upper right, you can actually see Donald Rumsfeld, later Secretary of Defense, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, which is ironic because about 10 years after this, we're going to have another war to take out Saddam Hussein. But we were supporting him publicly here. Privately, in the 1980s, we were supplying Iran with weapons, and this would be the basis for what became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Part of the Reagan administration were secretly selling weapons to the Iranians here, using that money to funnel to basically anti-communist forces in Central America, which Congress had specifically passed a law denying it was illegal for that administration to do that. In fact, Reagan almost, they were talking about impeachment charges, but they never fully connected the fact that he actually knew about the Iran-Contra affair. Either way, what you need to know at the end of this is that America was supporting both sides, frankly, just, I guess, hoping for more casualties on both sides. But it did leave these two nations completely wrecked economically, and an entire generation of young men lost to this war. Now, that does have an effect on the next war. In 1991, the United States is going to invade Iraq. Now, this becomes known as the Persian Gulf War, and it really began when Saddam Hussein invaded the southern nation of Kuwait. Kuwait is a very tiny nation, very, very oil-rich, and also an ally of the United States. When Saddam Hussein invaded, the United States went to the United Nations and said, listen, your job is to prevent war. We have a dictator who has just invaded this oil-rich nation to try and take over their resources. We need to stop them. Now, a lot of this was to stabilize the oil markets. I don't think there was any doubt about that at the time. Who knew what Saddam Hussein could do if he invaded Kuwait, and then who would be next? Would it be Iran, or would it be maybe even Saudi Arabia? We didn't know. In 1991, the United Nations, led by the United States, which supplied about 90% of the overall soldiers, invaded the nation of Iraq. Now, one of the most important things I'd like for you to remember is that this, in world history, is what we often declare as kind of the first modern technological war. We are fighting this war with the utmost, the newest technology. We're using laser-guided precision missiles, and the Iraqis are using, well, frankly, weapons that are 20 years old. And when you look at the death toll, you can actually see a tremendous difference. And this war is really over almost before it begins. Ultimately, it lasts about a year, less than that really. And while we do basically get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, we decide not to overthrow Saddam at this point. And frankly, a lot of people were questioning, whether we should have continued on and overthrown this dictator. And ultimately, we're going to see the U.S. involved here again in about 10 years. On September 11th, 2001, our nation suffered the most devastating terrorist attack that we had ever seen. The last part of this unit, we are going to look at the rise of extremism. We'll talk a little bit about terrorism and why it exists. But on that day, and I can say I was an 18-year-old man at that point. It was my first semester of college, and it was a very chaotic, it was confusing, and it was just a tragic time overall. We all quite literally watched 3,000 people die on live television, and it was tremendously horrible. Initially, there were, of course, calls for not just revenge, but we needed to bring justice to the people that had led this attack. Namely, Osama bin Laden, who we just previously mentioned, and his group Al Qaeda. The decision was made to go in to find bin Laden, the perpetrator of this attack, and to also topple the Afghani government, the Taliban, that had been controlling that government for a decade at this point. We went into Afghanistan in 2001 to take out the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. Now, even though bin Laden would escape, I remember one of my good friends in college had gone over there. He ultimately served about 3 tours, I believe. And I remember when he got back after the first tour in Afghanistan, I said, well, what do you think? Is bin Laden, still over there? And he kind of laughed. He said, no. He's like, everybody agrees. Bin Laden got out, within the first few weeks. And turns out he was exactly right. Bin Laden would escape. He would basically later be found in Pakistan, hiding in a compound there. But the war that emerges in Afghanistan would not be an easy one. No one has really ever fought a successful war in Afghanistan. We just saw the Soviets fail at it. Even going as far back as Alexander the Great, it was not an easy place to fight. But we would suffer a lot of casualties in this conflict, and it became, frankly, in a lot of ways, we got trapped in Afghanistan. We toppled, for the most part, the Taliban government, although they would still exist, and frankly, they have been revived in the last few years, and frankly, have been able to retake major portions of that country. But what would become America's longest-lasting war began in October of 2001. Very recently, President Biden has announced a full withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, which he has given the deadline of September 11th, 2021. Now, never in my life would I have expected that the United States would be fighting a 20-year war, but that is what we have seen here. The results, the United States have lost a little over 2,300 men and women that have been killed in that conflict, about 20,000 more wounded. And in terms of the Afghanistan people, about 140,000 have been killed. And again, that's often the trend we see when we fight major wars, is that civilians often suffer the heavy casualties among that. So Afghanistan has been just a tremendous turning point, tremendously horrible turning point in U.S. history as well. Because this has become a $1 trillion event, and again, tremendous loss of life. And at the end of the day, we got bin Laden. We had to find him in a different country, but in a lot of ways, the Taliban's kind of recovered. So I know that's a frustrating moment in our history, and one that I hope we learn some major lessons from. Now, 2 years later, the move was made to invade the nation of Iraq. Now, I want to make sure we understand that there was no connection between Iraq and 9/11. Saddam Hussein had no role in 9/11. There is absolutely zero connection there. The only connection is, of course, how close in proximity these invasions were. This took place in March of 2003, so about a year and a half after the invasion of Afghanistan. But we had seen a major foreign policy shift, which became known as the Bush Doctrine. President Bush in 2003 gave a speech titled the Axis of Evil speech, in which he highlighted the most dangerous nations to the United States, and Iraq was one of them. Now, he claimed, and the intelligence agencies and basically all Western nations, well, I shouldn't say that, not all Western nations, the United Kingdom provided intelligence as well, suggesting that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. President Bush was able to sell the American people on this idea that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that if Saddam Hussein was allowed to utilize them, that we would see perhaps mass killing, and that it was time to go in and take out that old dictator. Once again, we see that we underestimate the issue, and frankly, we simplify it, because it was not just about removing a dictator here. What we uncovered was, frankly, a power vacuum. It didn't take long for Saddam Hussein and his army to be put down, but what it unleashed was basically decades, well, centuries-old rivalries between the Shia and Sunni people in Iraq. And what we created was a situation that devolved into a civil war. And so the Iraqi people, led by extremists on both sides, began to attack one another, and we were kind of caught in the middle of it. It was a very deadly war. 4,500 U.S. were killed, a lot more urban populations than what we saw in Afghanistan, a lot more urban fighting. Over 1 million Iraqis have died as a result of this invasion. That is just a truly mind-boggling number. Again, it took about 8 years and over $1 trillion for us to fight this war. And I think history will judge us in the future as to whether this was the right move or not. I will say that ultimately there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. The intelligence was faulty. Perhaps Saddam Hussein was leading us to believe that, but ultimately it was bad intelligence that led us to invade Iraq, and we suffered one of the most brutal and long-lasting wars in U.S. history. Now, fast forward to 2010. We had a very interesting moment in the history of the Middle East, which became known as the Arab Spring. Now, I remember I went to Egypt back in 2008, a couple years before this happened. In fact, the pictures, I have to smile because all the pictures in the upper right-hand corner, I was actually staying in a hostel just about a block away from Tahrir Square, where those images were taking place. This became kind of the center of the revolution. But I remember when I was in Egypt, even I witnessed some, there were a lot of police security on street corners with machine guns, and you just got this sense that the relationship between the civilians and the government was not a very good one. There was a dictator in charge, President Mubarak, who had taken over after the assassination of Anwar el-Sadat, who we discussed in our last lecture. Mubarak would be overthrown by the Egyptian people in 2000. Well, it began in 2010. I don't remember exactly when he was overthrown. But this would be just one in multiple revolutions that would take place as a part of the Arab Spring. Ultimately, this revolution had gotten kicked off in the nation of Tunisia, in which you had the people rise up in Tunisia to overthrow the dictator there. And frankly, it looked for a while that we were going to see democracy take hold in the Middle East, that all of these nations, in fact, within a few years, you had about a dozen Middle Eastern nation and North African nations that had some sort of revolution, that they were overthrowing these dictators. And it was a very positive moment in the history of the world. But good things don't always last. Ultimately, some of the dictators began to fight back, and most of them were not successful, but some of them held on. That brings us to the Syrian Civil War. In 2011, Syrians began to rise up against the dictator Bashar al-Assad, and instead of just simply fading into the background and resigning his position, instead he fought back against the people, firing on protesters, and it devolved into a full-blown civil war. Now, this had the makings of kind of an old Cold War conflict, because the Russian Federation was backing the dictator al-Assad, whereas the United States was backing the people in this revolution. And frankly, it made things quite tense between us and Russia. Now, the result in Syria has been just a calamity from the very beginning. Not only have you had thousands and thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people killed in this conflict, but you have also had 7 million people who have lost their homes, have been displaced, and became refugees. This has sparked another tremendous wave of change because those 7 million Syrians have looked to move elsewhere. Syria is still in the middle of this civil war today, and those 7 million Syrians have tried to find refuge throughout the world. Many Western nations initially took them in. Some have refused to take them in, and ultimately, those that did take them in, some of them have had some political revolutions of themselves where they've kind of changed to close their borders. So this had tremendous effects on Western nations as well. But I don't want you to forget the brutality of what happened here in Syria. 600,000 people have been killed, 7 million displaced, 5 million seeking that refugee status. Ultimately, next time, we're going to talk about the rise of extremism, and we're going to talk about an event that comes out of the Syrian civil war with the rise of ISIS taking advantage of some of the chaos in this region. So I lied to you. I told you it was going to be a shorter lecture. I'm so sorry I do that from time to time. I find this stuff interesting. I hope you guys do too. As always, shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.